Hello and welcome to the 20th anniversary edition of the CMC. My name is Marion Edwards and I took over from Sue Knott as chair of the CMC Advisory Committee last autumn when we began to plan for this year's CMC. We're thrilled to be here in Sheffield City Hall and even more thrilled to be back in our spiritual home, the Showroom Cinemas, where it all began, tomorrow and Thursday. 80 people attended the first Show Commotion Children's Media Conference. And the first session was about the coming of broadband, which most of us knew nothing about. But by the time we left Sheffield, that small section of the children's TV industry, as it was back then, was aware of the potential of widespread online delivery of content and had started to think about the implications. And the rest, as they say, is history. Which is appropriate considering the wonderful Keynote interview we are about to experience with one of Britain's foremost thinkers and rethinkers about our history and how that impacts on the young audience. CMC's history over the last 20 years has been about bringing you the most current thinking around what matters to us as media makers and distributors, and always, if we can, looking to the future to prepare the industry for what lies ahead. The advisory committee that I chair is a group of around 35 people from every part of the kids' media business, and it represents two important things. One is that we are a pan-platform conference, the only one of its type in the world, which means that we welcome people from theatre, publishing, museums and events, licensing, digital media, educational media, and every aspect of audio and video delivery to young people. Our mantra is, if you talk to kids, you should talk to each other. And that's what we hope you'll do over the next couple of days. The second thing they represent is that you make CMC what it is. The advisory committee sets the theme, which this year is Power Up. And that's about empowering the audience, whilst also energizing the industry in these difficult times. The committee also constructs the program and chooses the sessions, almost all of which are proposed by people in the industry and then produced by volunteers. We are truly by the industry, for the industry, and for all of that hard work by so many companies, employees, and freelancers, CMC is very grateful. And I mentioned the volunteers, so let's not forget our army of brilliant student volunteers. You've already seen them at reception and with their foam fingers pointing the way here tonight. There are over 80 of them here from all over the country. Please, let's thank them for their hard work. And finally, a special thank you to our fantastic array of sponsors. None of this would be possible without their support. Those you see here are our lanyard and patron sponsors this year. There are 18 of them from every part of the kids' media industry, and we are proud and extremely grateful that they want to support the conference in the way they do. And a big thank you to the sponsor for this keynote, which is Jellyfish Pictures, one of the UK's leading animation and VFX studios, with credits including DreamWorks feature animations, Spirit Untamed, and How to Train Your Dragon Homecoming, and the British animated series Dennis and Gnasher Unleashed. Jellyfish's animation team are currently in production on Werewolf, a series for Netflix and Lime based on the popular books by Curtis Jobling, as well as a movie adaptation of one of Roald Dahl's most beloved children's books for Netflix features. It's quite a tongue twister, this bit. I'm trying to be very careful. Plus, they recently started work on an undisclosed new feature animation for a Hollywood studio. Watch this space. So now, let's get things started. We are so pleased that Sonali Shah agreed to be our interviewer for this keynote. Sonali is currently the host for the BBC's Escape to the Country and Sunday morning breakfast on Magic Radio. She also has her own slot on Steph's Packed Lunch on Channel 4 and hosts ITV's Tonight. She has released her first children's book, The Best Diwali Ever, So she is truly representative of the modern multi-channel, multi-platform approach. But of course, we all still love her best of all for hosting Newsround from 2006 to 2011. Will you please give a huge CMC welcome to Sonali Shah.
Thank you, Marion. My children still can't believe I hosted Newsround. I will not show them any video evidence, so they're just stuck with listening to me on Magic and guessing if my contributors on Escape to the Country will buy that mystery house, and occasionally offending me by going, "Oh, Mummy, you are sometimes a little bit funny, aren't you?" Yeah. It's funny, from the mouth of babes. Hello and welcome, everyone, to the opening keynote of the Children's Media Conference. It is lovely to be back here. And as Marion just said, the theme for this year's conference is Power Up, so it is apt, it is appropriate for the conference to start with speakers who are dedicated to empowering unheard stories, unheard voices, and experiences. Our keynote speaker tonight is David Olusoga. As a British-Nigerian historian and BAFTA award-winning presenter and broadcaster, David has dedicated his career to highlighting the untold stories and histories of Britain. David's books, Black and British, A Forgotten History, The Kaiser's Holocaust, The World's War, and his first book, targeting young readers, Black and British, A Short Essential History, I've stolen my daughter's copy from her room, has awarded him the Penn Hessel Tiltman Prize, the Longman History Today Trustees Award, and a British Book Award, as well as a couple more. As he unpacks the past, and through doing so, examines the present, David has been provided with a unique perspective on the challenges faced by young people today. And we can be sure that he will want to, this evening, highlight the direct impact that media has on young people, their perception of history, and their place in the world today. And of course, the scale of the responsibility that children's media has to its audience. So before we hear from David, I think it's right to hear from one member of that audience. We are going to welcome the first of this year's CMC Changemakers, all young people who've achieved something special and have something to say to us about how we impact their lives. All we have to do is listen and act. Izzy Garbutt was elected to Youth Parliament early last year and since then has actively campaigned for reform of the current education system and highlighted the concerning decline in young people's mental health. In November last year, Izzy addressed the Youth Parliament with a speech that received overwhelming response, not just from young people, from teachers, government representatives, and celebrities. Let's take a look.
The education system is supposedly created for young people. So please, listen when we say it is failing us. For years we've been calling for a curriculum for life, a curriculum which will see us leaving school with a greater understanding of the world around us. We are pleading for more emphasis on employability, communication skills, and personal well-being. Young people are more than just letters or numbers that they see on a piece of paper in mid-August. We are not a percentage of A stars to Cs. We are not evidence in an Ofsted report, and we are not a pass or a fail. Well-being must become a priority, and nurturing the development of young people as individuals should be the aim of education, not exam results. So no, I don't know how to maintain a good mental health. I don't understand how to pay tax, and I have no idea what I want to be when I grow up. But go on, Madam Deputy Speaker, ask me, and I'll tell you all about the quadratic formula.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Izzy Garbutt.
I'm Izzy Garbutt. I'm currently a member of Youth Parliament for Wigan and Leigh. You may recognise me as the girl who stood in the House of Commons and declared that I can recite the quadratic formula. And although I never imagined that my name would become synonymous with an algebraic formula, I'm so happy it has, because it's allowed me to spread a message that I am so very passionate about. Quick fun fact, I hate public speaking. I know it's a bit ironic, even after countless speeches, events, conferences, and interviews, I'm still stood here today feeling as though I'm about to be mauled by a bear. But I know that what I have to say deserves to be heard, that young people deserve to be heard, and that when I was stood in the House of Commons, that was the only thing stopping me from running out of that chamber. After the blow, which was my speech, applause still ringing in my ears, and my heart rate finally returning to below 200 beats per minute, I realised what I'd done, and it felt right. And I think it felt right to others too. After being encouraged by friends to post the recording of my speech on TikTok, it quickly gained attention. Being viewed millions of times on various social media platforms, I was overwhelmed by the response my message received. I was even trending on LinkedIn, which I didn't know could happen. And although the scale of this reaction was terrifying, I had young people thanking me for speaking on their behalf and articulating their frustrations. It seemed that not only the young people of Wigan and Leigh who elected me felt disenfranchised by the education system, but so did young people nationally. As a member of Youth Parliament, I've been elected by thousands of young people in my constituency based on a manifesto where I campaigned for something called a curriculum for life, a curriculum designed to prepare young people for the future. This captures not only traditional academic subjects, but also life skills, tech skills, financial knowledge, and mental health education. Emphasis needs to be put on work experience and careers advice, not only to help prepare young people for the future, but allowing them to choose something they enjoy. We spend around 2,750 days in compulsory education. At 14, we choose our GCSEs, which determine at 16 what A-levels we can take, which determine at 18 what degree we can get, which determines what job you can do for the rest of your life. This conveyor belt of education reinforces the falsehood that we all live, work, and succeed in the same way, and grow at the same regimented milestones. Children are forced to make monumental decisions about their future at such a young age, and often they aren't equipped with the knowledge or experience to make this decision an informed one. And when they aren't sure, they are pushed onto a predetermined pathway of what may be considered respectable, not what they enjoy. We need a system which prioritises individuals, their goals, their passions, their skills, and we need young people to be excited at the prospect of learning and choosing a career, and prepared to enter a field in which they will thrive. According to PricewaterhouseCoopers, 60% of employers identified lack of preparation for the world of work in recruits from schools, colleges, and universities. Investment in work experience and careers advice from a younger age are tangible ways to ensure that young people can explore decisions about their future before it's too late. So you don't get to sixth form unable to do the subjects you want to because of the GCSEs you picked at 14. So you don't end up doing a degree you are completely uninterested in because you've never been facilitated to find your passion. So you don't pay upwards of £30,000 going to university when really an apprenticeship better suits your goals. I've recently come to the end of my A-levels, which accumulated to a 4-week exam period, and it's difficult to articulate the anticlimax of its end. I worked tirelessly for 2 years, often to the detriment of my own mental health. Each exam I sat was about 2 hours long. 2 years becomes 2 hours. Sleepless nights, full days spent in libraries, missed family get-togethers, tears, eye twitches, and over 900 flashcards all culminated into 2 hours. And the months leading up to those 2 hours weren't fun either. I remember oversleeping and missing my A-level geography exam. My heart was pounding, my legs were shaking, I felt nothing but pure fear. Except I don't do geography. And I hadn't missed any exams. It was just another stress stream. In that week alone, my history exam was interrupted by a Harry Styles concert. I'd fallen off my chair in the GCSE RE exam I did 2 years ago, and I was given a psychology paper that turned out to be an Argos catalogue. I think it's safe to say that the stress was getting to me a little bit. But beyond the silly anecdotes and occasional eye bags, I was unhappy. All of my peers were. I have one friend who was hospitalised, fainting 10 times a day due to stress. Another was having regular panic attacks in and out of college. I've seen people going into and coming out of exams crying. Some of the smartest people I know paralysed by stress to the point where they can't perform in the exam. Each of us were terrified by the notion that the entirety of our future depended on 8 exams, the one chance we have to prove ourselves. And if we run out of time or misread a question, that's it. Since the 2015 reforms to A-levels and GCSEs, content has increased and summative exams have been prioritised within linear courses. There is barely enough time to cover the entire syllabus, and teachers are forced to teach the test because of the metrics against which schools are measured. It's noted that 73% of respondents to an NEU poll believe that student mental health has worsened as a result of these reforms. I took A-level history, which I loved. I'm off to do an undergraduate degree in it actually, so as you can imagine, I'm incredibly giddy for opening for Professor David Olusoga. But leading up to my exams, I memorised the import and export statistics of Britain's trade and commerce with each of its colonies, mandates and dominions every year from 1857 to 1967. For politics, I also memorised the electoral outcomes for each party in the 2015, 17 and 19 elections, as well as hypothetical reruns of those elections using AV, SV, CPL, STV and AMS. So when I say that memorisation has become a synonym for learning, I mean it. Spoiler alert, I wasn't asked anything about trade and commerce or electoral outcomes. In fact, across all the 8 papers I sat, I was probably assessed on about 20% of my knowledge. This is why the involvement of young people is integral to the success of policies regarding not only education, but society. And as long as we are ignored, spoken over, or spoken for, progress will be minimal. I distinctly remember being sat in my GCSE maths class in 2021, possibly being taught about the quadratic formula. And our class discussion turned to politics. I remember the boy next to me with an air of confidence and sensibility declaring that he will vote when he turns 30. That's when politics will start to affect him. I was perplexed. I think I called this poor boy ignorant and highlighted all the flaws in his logic. I reminded him that as of 2020, the government literally decided whether we could leave the house or not. It also decided what we learnt in schools and how long we were there for. It made financial decisions which impact us, our families, and our future. It decided how much funding goes into youth mental health services, and even whether the planet will still be habitable by the time we reach 30. But I realise now that perhaps I was too harsh. Perhaps he thought it was so sensible because it is what he's been told by adults. Perhaps it's what we've all been told. This issue does not concern you. Explicitly or implicitly, young people are consistently fed the narrative that politics is too complex for them. We don't have the worldly experience or competence, we haven't yet earned an opinion, and we definitely haven't earned a vote. This is why events like this are so important. It's why we need a youth parliament and why I'm stood here today. Young people are a vessel of hope for a better future. Within us is the potential for the creation of a more empathic society. We need to show young people that their voice does matter in a world which refuses to listen, because these issues do concern us. Austerity, Brexit, terror attacks, racism, COVID, Partygate, Ukraine, cost of living, strikes, climate change. Perhaps the youth of today spend so much time looking down at their phones because they're afraid of looking up and being confronted by the world around them. Even as someone interested in politics, I often turn the news off, choose to protect myself with a shield of ignorance. But that shield can only hold for so long, and eventually the weight of the world around us ends up on the shoulders of young people. The purpose of education needs to be reimagined so that we are equipped to navigate the challenges of the 21st century, to be prepared for the future, manage what must be one of the most challenging economic periods in decades, be emotionally resilient, be kind, be politically aware, and be the change needed for a better future. I turn 18 in August, and I stand here on the precipice of adulthood, having completed compulsory education and wholeheartedly understanding why so many people feel disillusioned with it. Speaking here today as a changemaker is such an incredible honour, but I'm yet to feel deserving of the title. My words are not one voice, but an echo of young people who have been ignored for too long, a chorus of individuals demanding change. And although often bleak, we are united by hope that one day no grade, no exam, no essay, and no formula can make a child feel unworthy. Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Izzy. And that may have been the opening act for our keynote speaker, but that felt like a keynote speech in itself. I'll always hook you up with 2 for the price of 1. Value for money is what I will give you. And I know that David will have some thoughts on what Izzy has had to say this evening. Should we find out? Let's do that. Over the last 2 decades, David Olusoga has worked as a historian, a producer, a presenter, highlighting aspects of our history and culture that are too often overlooked or simply erased. His endeavors in publishing and media have captivated and captured audiences and highlighted those forgotten parts of history, including but not limited to Windrush, slavery, the NHS, and Black British history. In 2019, David was awarded an OBE for services to history and community integration. And earlier this year, he received a BAFTA Special Award in recognition of his groundbreaking screen career. Let's have a look at some of that acceptance speech.
Even before I even dreamed that I would one day work in television, it had already changed my life. It was watching the history documentaries of Michael Woods when I was a teenager in the 80s that made me decide to study history. It was watching David Attenborough reveal to me the natural world that made me get on a plane with a backpack in my 20s and 30s. This astonishing industry, it broadened my horizons, it enriched my life. I owe television so much.
Get up on your feet, do what you can to welcome Mr. David Olusoga. Will notice it's missing this evening. Let's dive straight in. In that acceptance speech, one of the things that you said is that working in the media has been the greatest privilege, but also the greatest responsibility of your life. Can you assess the scale of that responsibility that the media and children's media in particular has to younger generations?
I sometimes think my colleagues underestimate it. One of the many challenges that television in particular faces is we don't represent the country as it is. We're overrepresented in privately educated, overrepresented in Oxbridge, underrepresented in people with backgrounds like mine. I was brought up in a council estate, a single-parent family. My mother, who was a remarkable woman, did everything she could to educate her children, but she had infrastructure. She had the BBC. She had a university system that allowed children to go without acquiring debts, and she had this capacity to use this media infrastructure as part of a sort of ersatz education to make up for the failings of my school. And when you haven't got very much, what TV can offer you, what media can offer you, what books can offer you becomes central to your life. So as I said in that speech, I mean, I wanted to be an historian not because of school, but because of what was happening on television. I wanted to travel because I knew there were places to go to because I'd seen them on TV.
Do you think then people are not being truthful with themselves if they are underestimating the scale of those responsibilities? Or just putting them to the back of their mind because it's easier? It's hard to hear the truth.
I think there's a metric that we don't get in television very often. We get the metrics of viewing figures, of impact, of streaming numbers. What we don't get is metrics of lives changed. And there are programs that can equip people with knowledge, can equip people with passions that they'll carry for the rest of their lives. When we made the remake of the series Civilizations a few years ago, 5 years ago, myself and Simon Sharma and Mary Beard were inundated with letters and emails and people we met in the street who described how Kenneth Clark, when they were young back in the 70s, showing them this world of art, showing them, it was very much European art, but showing them the range of the European artistic achievement, for 12 hours on television, created passions that shaped their lives, shaped what they did, what they bought, where they went on holiday, in some places where they moved to, where they lived and what they studied. We're not good at measuring that. And the metrics we have in the media don't measure lives changed. We don't have a sort of box for that. There's not an iPlayer metric for that. And I think that leads to a predilection to forget that TV can do this. It can shape people's interests and passions and lives and beliefs and become part of what makes them who they are. That knowledge, to me, weighs like a huge responsibility because I remember sort of lying in bed thinking about what I could do or what I could be or where I could go because of things I'd watched on TV.
If we don't, we've all been in meetings where we say we're putting the audience front and center, but if we do not step up to those responsibilities, what are the stakes? Are we already seeing the consequences of years of not stepping up?
Well, I think if you have no metric for impact, for that sort of deep cultural impact, but you have other metrics, you're bound to follow those other metrics. And I think we make an awful lot of frivolous television. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not going to lay into Love Island and things like that. That's all fantastic. But there is also, I think, a predilection towards titillation and what is unimportant. And I mean, one of the worst pejoratives somebody can apply to a program or an idea for a program in television is worthy. And we use these attributes that something is clever or intelligent or worthy, we use those attributes as pejoratives. I don't think that's the sign of a healthy media attitude, atmosphere.
How much do you then worry about what our children are able to consume today, what they have access to? You, as you say in that speech, talked about how TV changed your life. Will we hear a 9-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 16-year-old saying that now?
Well, I hope so, because I think TV is a mediated and controlled environment, unlike many others. And I think TV is a world where you can, well, what I should say is public service broadcasting is a world where we can engineer that. We can engineer opportunities for people to expand, and that happens all the time. I think some of the, particularly on BBC Three, I think some of the programming is brilliantly targeted to make young people think about their society, analyze their society, be aware of other young people living in very, very different circumstances. I think there's some astonishingly sophisticated children's television out there. The thing which I worry about now when I talk to younger members of my family, when I talk to young people who I work with at Manchester University, and people who come to my talks, is that they have access to everything, but that mediation, that curatorship isn't really there. They've got to do it themselves, and that's really, really difficult. And the other fundamental problem, and I hear this a lot, is a lot of what you might want to access as a young person, particularly when you're thinking about your education, thinking about expanding your knowledge, is behind paywalls. The phrase I've heard from young people is misinformation is free, knowledge costs. And I think we've got an enormous problem there with kids who we call digital natives, but who are not actually allowed to be native in many of the areas where they would get proper journalistic and academic knowledge. The fact that we haven't found a way of making academic papers available freely to schools and kids doing A-level, I think is a real problem. I mean, the number one thing that you want people to do when they come to university and study history is understand this world of journals and papers. They don't, because they've had no access to it, because it's only when they go to university and they get their key that they can, for the first time, access these things. So they're digital natives, but parts of the internet are off bounds to them for financial reasons. I think that's an enormous problem. But there's something else as well, which I kind of think is enormously different from my childhood, which is, I didn't know much about the world. And I think there was a huge value in not knowing that much about the world. I didn't know that my ambitions were unrealistic because I didn't understand the world very well. And I can't imagine what it is like to have access to that many ways of understanding how the world operates at that young an age. And I sort of wonder, it obviously, for some young people, is expansive, and they see the opportunities and they grasp them and then become entrepreneurial. But I think for others, it must be incredibly intimidating. There is a sort of, I feel there's a need to imagine before you see the mountain, to see work out who you are before you see the scale of the challenge.
Before you see those parameters.
Yeah.
And as you say, there are two sides to it. For some people, it will be totally overwhelming. But then when you travel around the world, and as you do so often, you'll have heard from young people saying, the amount of information out there means I can now have an education. I don't have to travel to go to university or things like that. So there is opportunity in what we're seeing. And sometimes I will, by the way, use the term TV, and I do mean what the wider. It's almost like you have to retrain your brain not to. But yes, I certainly mean the media when I say TV, because TV on its own does not exist. You mentioned information and misinformation, disinformation. So many of us always confuse the two. You've previously said that the complexities of history is that two things can be true at the same time. Is that what we're seeing that certainly in the adult world, but a kid right now having to try and figure out the difference between the two, you must be seeing that, and you must be talking about that so much with your students.
Well, I think this is one of the areas where I'm enormously confident and enormously upbeat. The really bizarre thing about our relationship with history at this moment in the 2020s is that if you want to see people with a really mature understanding of what history is, what its function is, what its limitations are, how to interact with it, you go to young people, not old people. The people with a problem with history, who demand that history only tell them certain forms of reinforcing self-aggrandizing stories, who want history to be a constant pageant of heroes and victories and glorious chapters, tend to be people who are older, who were conditioned not just with those stories, but to understand that is the function of history. The cliche, I was talking to somebody in the heritage industry, and they were saying the cliche is now that the family, the multi-generational family, will go to the stately home and end up in the cafe having scones and tea inevitably. And the grandparents and the parents have walked around looking at the paintings, enjoyed the gardens. Well, the kids have been on their phone, Googling it to see where the money came from. And I think there's a huge amount of truth in that. Now, they are capable of going, yeah, that's a nice garden. That's a nice picture of a posh white bloke. But they also understand that behind every great fortune, there is, supposedly a great crime. And they're comfortable with the idea that history doesn't have to always make you feel comfortable. So the great irony, as I said, of this moment is that the people who are mature about their relationship with history tend to be the people who are technically immature because they're the youngest. So I have huge confidence that what is happening now in history, where I think a far more grown up, a far more nuanced understanding of British history and the function of history is beginning to emerge out into the public discourse. It was always there in the academic discourse. That is absolutely the engine for that is generational change. So there, I think there's nothing to do other than let them lead, but also to provide them with the materials.
There's so much hope there. So they are the ones asking the questions. They will not tolerate holes in the history they're being told. Yeah. And as you say, they're comfortable. So often, how many of us have heard someone from a generation above us or two generations above us say, that doesn't make us feel good. And you don't want to hear history that often doesn't make you feel good. But if it's not provided by, for example, the children's media, they have to go seeking it elsewhere. Where can they find it? That's the point.
Well, I think one of the great advantages they have, and this is where the internet and where the multiple streams of information are fantastic, which is that when I was at school, I didn't know that there were missing chapters. you have to know there's something missing in order to go looking for it. You have to realize that something has been extracted to realize that there's a hole. I didn't know, and so I made lots of presumptions subconsciously. I presumed there were no black people in history because there were no black people in my history lessons. One of the pivotal moments in my life was because when I first got into history, it was not, I didn't want to study empire and slavery and colonial genocide and the things I study now. I wanted to be into the Second World War because all my mates were. And, the 80s, when I grew up, Britain was saturated in the culture of the Second World War. Most of the toys for boys, a very gendered society, were war toys, airfix and action men. So it was a really kind of militarized society. Everybody, every second bloke's dad had done national service. Everyone's granddad had been in the Second World War. So it was a deeply militarized society. I was just into that because it was what everyone was into. One day my mother said to me, do you know that there were Nigerians like your father who fought in the Second World War? And I almost didn't believe her. And she said they fought in the First World War as well. But there was nothing at all in what I was taught and what was available to me to make me think anything other than that those wars had been fought entirely by white Europeans. Because there was no black people or brown people in the war films. The toys did not depict. The magazines did not depict. I made a program, a little film for Google last year, where I found online, where else, the box of soldiers that I had as a little boy, the British 8th Army, the desert rats who fought Rommel in North Africa, the German Africa Corps. And I wanted to use it in this film because I remembered it. I had to image it in my head, and it was exactly as I remembered. It was a picture of a bunch of white guys with their tin hats and their shorts and Lee Enfield rifles, and that was my image of the 8th Army. Well, the 8th Army was, in fact, one of the most diverse military forces ever assembled. It contained thousands of men from what's now India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh. It contained Africans. It contained people from Malta, from Cyprus. It contained people from all over the British Empire, because it was an empire at war. That was invisible. Now, a kid today being told, here's a whitewashed image of the Second World War, they just got to go online. They can disprove that in 5 clicks. I didn't even know there was something to disprove. So that's, I think it makes it very hard being a teacher. If you're a teacher missing things out, if you want to talk about, I live in Bristol, if you wanted to say, Bristol boomed in the 18th century and not explain why, I think someone's going to come in, the next history lesson and go, Miss, Sir, why didn't you mention this? Because they can go and work out the reasons. They've got access to knowledge to fill those holes. And they also have this kind of generational kind of spider sense that there are holes. I think it must be really hard being a history teacher because these kids absolutely, they want to interrogate this stuff. Now that's what academic history is like. Is that the whole story? What am I learning? What is that bias? Is that source reliable? They seem to have that almost instinctively, that you kind of interrogate this stuff. You don't kind of wallow in it and go, well, that makes me feel wonderful. Let's go and have some scones in the gift shop. They are sort of naturally quite critical in their approach to history.
But I wonder if that information is feeding up from the younger generation up enough, and whether people want to hear. I mean, the holes in history is so true. I started in radio, 23 years ago. I think we've been in the industry a similar amount of time. And I remember getting a call.
It's had less of an impact on you.
We both got the melanin, don't you worry, we both got the melanin. And I got a call from a member of the BNP who called me up at the radio station I was working at, and he told me to go back to where I came from. And I sort of gave him this response, perhaps naively, similar to a response I used to give people at school when I used to get called the P word, where I gave them a bit of a history lesson. And I just said, well, my grandparents were born in India under British rule, so they're British. My parents were born in Kenya and Tanzania under British rule, so they're British. And I was born here with a British passport. I am British and English. Where do you want me to go? You came and brought me here. I'm here because, And it's almost like he didn't realize that I was third generation Brit because of that child of the empire. He didn't, and he was silent. I didn't mean to make a stand. I just didn't know what else to say. The questions are being asked by the younger people. The awareness is there. As you say, it's really hard being a history teacher. But do those history teachers genuinely have the access and the time to be teaching that? Izzy's spoken about that disconnect, the school of life, us not teaching our children what they need to learn, whether it be life skills or history. Why are we not seeing that through the government, through the national curriculum, through schools, in some parts of the media? Why are we not seeing that? Have you been able to assess where that disconnect is coming from?
I think it's partly because we haven't supported teachers. I don't think teachers have been given the resources. I don't think the publishing industry or the educational publishing industry has been ahead of the game enough in terms of providing materials. There was a report by the Royal Historical Society, I think it was 2 years ago now, in which I think it was 2% of teachers felt confident teaching Black history. The will, in my experience, is very much there. I meet teachers all the time who are desperate to teach a more diverse, a more colonial, imperial, interconnected version of British history, and very often they are at liberty to do so because they're teaching in academies. The lack of confidence, I think, comes from the lack of support and the lack of materials that have been made available to them. The thing about younger people is, we call them digital natives. They're also diversity natives. They've never known any society that didn't look like the one that we live in today. That is their norm. The example I tend to use is if you look at the England football team, the average age is now 26. The average age of an MP in this parliament is 52. Now, that England team is what England looks like. Now, England's more diverse than the other nations, particularly urban England. But if you want to kind of look at the future, if you want to kind of time travel 20 years, go to an infant school in Birmingham, in this city, in Leeds, in Bradford, in London. That's what the country's going to look like in 20 years' time. By one projection, by 2050, the country will be about a 1/3, 30%, I should say, mixed or non-white, some kind of form of kind of not being white British. That's all they've ever known. That's what the musicians that they admire look like, the football teams that they support, the whole kind of world of YouTube influencers. It is kind of hyper diverse. So they've never known anything else. And so to try to teach them an island story version of British history that is some sort of idealized kind of fantasy version of the 1950s, they kind of see through it because it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't equip them to understand that the world that they actually live in. And if we teach them this history, which basically is silent about the empire, that question about, but why do I eat this? Why is this called that? Why are my friends from there and there and there? Why is the England team the way it is? You can't make sense of the world you live in from a version of a history that disconnects the story of empire, the biggest story in British history. It's got to be the ultimate question, the ultimate challenge for historians. How did this small island, that was really behind in the race for global empire in the 17th century, how did it become the biggest empire in the world in the 19th century? If you can't include that in history, I just think you're inevitably going to have a disconnect with that generation. And teachers, from my experience, completely get that, and they want to be the solution. As I said, what they're not given very often is support.
And what you're getting, therefore, and now you can understand why, is you're losing the kids, aren't you? Because if what they're learning here doesn't make sense with what they're seeing there, especially in urban areas, you'll just think, what's the point? This is, as Izzy said, this is not equipping her for this.
Yeah.
And teachers don't have the time to campaign. They've got enough. They don't have the time to then, be those trailblazers. Some of them are, but then they get, in some parts of the media, you see them getting attacked because the word woke is used in such a negative, and I hate that. It's, if you're not woke, what's the point? I think I see it as such a positive thing. But it's strange how it's been turned into this attack on people who try to teach more, to try and educate people more. What did you make of what Izzy had to say? You must have heard that story from other young people too.
Yeah, I think it's a common experience. And I think that sense that this world that is delivered in the classroom, this this schema doesn't work for the lives that they live and doesn't reflect the country that they're actually operating in. And that desire for knowledge, it can be satiated through the internet, through multiple media sources, but it should also be part of the classroom. And I think it's really difficult. I'm very, very cautious telling teachers what they should and shouldn't teach. I understand the pressures. Many members of my family are teachers. I also understand that the curriculum is not always what's always taught, and that there is much more leeway. But there does seem to be, in many ways, a generational disconnect between the demands for information and for story among young people and what we're familiar with, what we're comfortable with as older generations.
So there are gaps. There are gaps. Is it our responsibility to be filling those gaps? Are we doing enough to fill those gaps?
Well, I don't think my professions are doing enough. I mean, I work in newspapers, in television, and in publishing. I don't think we've done enough to. And it's not so much making specialist programs. It's about what do we miss out? When we're telling other stories, how do we marginalize people without thinking? And I'm sometimes less concerned with worrying about whether there's going to be a program or an article about Mary Seacole in October than I am about when we talk about the Industrial Revolution. Are we going to talk about the cotton industry? It's not about specialist content so much. It's about not excluding the story of empire, the biggest story and the British story, from everything else that we do.
It's about when you're telling that story, making sure you've got those extra lines in it to give the bigger picture. I'm using you to fill the gaps that I think. Well, you've done it actually. I was watching one of your documentaries. My daughter had just learnt about the Romans, and she came down the stairs and she just could not stop watching you. And you were the person that told her that the first Black people in Britain were Roman. She hadn't learned that in her Roman chapter at school. I'd taken her to Rome last year, and she didn't, I didn't tell her that then because I didn't know. You are filling that gap for so many families, I'm sure. Someone like Satnam Sangera's just, we've got his book as well about the subcontinent, stolen history. What made you kind of move into, you've had your voice, you were always talking to the whole family because you've got that really lovely way of explaining. What made you think, right, but actually I need to target children right now?
Well, in some ways, that's a story of a profound failure and a failure of imagination on my part, because it was, and I think this is something that's really, really important and something that has also changed and that in a very positive direction that needs to be flagged up, is that it was not expected and it didn't occur to me to write books for children. When I first started writing history books, nobody in publishing suggested, once you'd had a successful book, that you should write a children's version for it. What changed that in the industry was Peter Frankopan, when he wrote his children's version of his book, Silk Road. Now, that was not something that was put to him. Nobody rushed up to him and said, I know something that would be really good, let's do this, let's expand your work and make it available to young people. Peter, with some skepticism, or facing some skepticism, pushed for that to happen. And he showed the industry and writers that you could be a serious writer of scholarly history, which Peter absolutely certainly is scholarly than almost all of us. And at the same time, you could write for children. Now, I kind of saw that, but still didn't do anything, because it just didn't occur to me. And I think if I'm really honest with myself, I didn't have any interest in writing with children. I probably slightly subconsciously looked down on children's publishing, didn't think of it as proper literature. I probably had a too glamorous, windswept image of myself as a literary writer.
But I actually find that hard to believe, because in your writing for all of your adult, which makes them sound really dodge, your BBC One documentaries, let's put it that way, and the others, you're writing. My 9-year-old was watching that, so you were already doing it without realizing. I know I'm a strong storyteller, and I know that I'm a very good writer, and I can
I have an ability to write
Good
with
is
clarity.
different because, and I had this at Newsround, people used to look down on people that often, and I'm talking to the wrong audience here, we know how amazing we all are, but people used to, but in terms of skilled writing, because if you can explain the economy to a 9-year-old, you can explain it to anyone. But anyone working solely in adult media would think, oh, you've got to be a child to write for it. They didn't understand that. Actually, that takes more energy, more knowledge to be able to break it down.
Well, I think because of the way I write, I had some advantages, but those advantages could only come into play if I actually made the decision. And I'm, as I said, I think this has been a abrogation of duty on my part. I mean, I'd like to think I'm making up for it now, but it was literally, it was parents. It was parents who recognized me from television, who'd read my adult version of Black and British is 600 pages, sorry. It's a very big book, and I've expanded it since then. And they would, repeatedly, I was stopped on the tube, on the train, on the street by parents, often parents of black kids, but not always, saying you should write a children's version. And it happened so often that I went to my agent and said, maybe they're right. And he said, yeah, maybe they are.
Parent power.
But it shouldn't have taken that. There was one woman in particular, a Jamaican woman, who stopped me at Paddington Station and said, look, I'm having to use African-American literature to teach my kids about black history, and it's not good enough. And she really, really made me think that that I was in a position where I could do something to help there. Now, the reason I regard it as an abrogation of duty is that one of the key life-changing moments for me, alongside my mother, revealing to me that black people were in history, was when I was 16 and I bought a book called Staying Power, which was the first big encyclopedic book on black British history. It had been published 2 years earlier, 1984, by the writer and historian Peter Fryer. This time last week, I was at an unveiling of a plaque on the house he used to live in London with his daughter and granddaughter, because his book means that much to me. I gave a speech there. But I was 16, and there was a book available that I was able to afford and able to buy with the money from my first job that explained to me I was part of a longer trajectory, that black and British was a legitimate identity, that black people had lived in Britain for 1700 years. And I knew intimately what it was like as a 16-year-old to read that book and devour that book, and how it changed my sense of myself and my relation to my country. Now, there could have been a version of that book for a 9-year-old, if publishing had worked in that way then. There could have been a book that I could have read at 12, when I desperately would have needed it. And I was in a position to produce those books, and yet it had not occurred to me. And I think that speaks to a really powerful disconnect between a world of ideas and letters and intellectualism and public history and the world of education and of children's books, which I think is beginning to break down, but I think it's quite toxic. The fact that it hadn't occurred to me. And even in the self-interested way, commercially, it hadn't occurred to me. I was at the Hay&Y Literary Festival last year, and there's a certain amount of kind of competitiveness with writers. And one of the ways it's very visible, you're standing here, you may have noticed slight egos, but one of the metrics that's very visible at a literary festival like Hay&Y is the size of the signing queue. How many people have come? And in this room full of lots of very big, household name writers, the person with the longest signing queue by about 500% was Liz Pichon. And Liz was there for about half a day, got through about 4 pens, left with our repetitive strain injuries, signing these books. And if just in a commercial sense, children's publishing is 40% of publishing. So it's not just that I kind of didn't occur to me and I was imagining myself as a different sort of writer. It's the fact that the commercial opportunities weren't at the forefront of people's minds. That this complete disconnect between a world that sees itself as literary and a world that thinks that children don't deserve literature. It's just powerfully subconscious, and I do regard it as an abrogation of duty. And it's fascinating how it's breaking down. You mentioned Satnam. Satnam published Empire Land instantly, his publishers wanted it to write a book like the one I'd written for Black and British. James Holland, the Second World War historian, has written children's versions of his book. Dominic, what's it called? I've forgotten his name. From History Hit. He's written Dominic Sambrook's written children's books. It's kind of now becoming the normal way that if you have a successful history book, that your agent, your publisher will go, write a children's book. Now that's great.
Your big-headed authors have cottoned on, the publishers have cottoned. Well, that's great. And you've got, what do you write? You're writing every day?
Black History for Every Day of the Year, which I'm writing with my older sister Yinka, who is a Doctor of Education here at Sheffield University, and my younger sibling Kemi, who's a graphic designer. So we're sort of producing that together, which is kind of fascinating. Siblings writing a book together. It's but what happens in my previous children's books, I went to my sister and said, tell me what I'm doing wrong here, help me write for children. So they were kind of involved anyway. Kemi's busy designing a logo for my new company, so we kind of worked together anyway. So we just wanted to do it kind of publicly together. And but that very powerful thing that an industry that in 2020, because in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, was looking itself in the mirror and looking at its failings. I think the fact that publishing, those two things have happened simultaneously. That publishing has realized that children's books are not this other world. That a book can exist and be successful across multiple iterations for children. I think that it really is a sea change. It really is a change in the attitudes of agents, publishers, and writers.
You mentioned 2020. By the way, I've only got a couple of more questions, and I really want to hear from you. So any questions, do have a think, and I will get you to raise your hands very soon. You mentioned 2020. I don't think we can let you leave without mentioning the McTaggart Lecture, and making sure that we are speaking to young people also, of course, means listening to them in our productions. And you talked about that specifically, how we need to see that representation, those voices, we need them not just out there being listened to, but within our teams. To nearly 3 years on from when you gave that lecture, have you had the time to sit and think about what you've seen, whether, people can talk the talk. Have they put those things into action in a way that you would have liked to have seen?
I think there's been some progress. I think there's been faster progress than any other time in my career. I've seen young people, particularly young people of color, be valued and been given opportunities that I've never seen before, and that makes me feel positive. I think the industry's understanding of its inbuilt class bias and the way that it's structured as a freelance industry, which acts as a disqualification from people from certain backgrounds. I think it's the fact that it's still overwhelmingly London-centric, and this pretense that it's not. To have a career where you can move from job to job, you really need to be in London. You can just about survive in Manchester and Bristol, not many other places. And if you haven't got that access to the capital, you haven't got somewhere to stay, you haven't got a sofa to surf, you're pushed out. I think in socioeconomic terms, I don't think the industry's doing very well. And of course, we're now at a moment which will really test whether any of that progress is real, because we're now in a recession. Now, the last time television declined, the number of jobs decreased rather than increased. What we saw was a collapse in the number of people from minority backgrounds who were able to keep their jobs in the industry. We saw this huge reduction in diversity. The people who have to leave the industry when hard times come, as they have once again, are people who don't have the family support to live in a freelance, operate in a freelance environment. So I fear what we're going to see, because this move towards an entirely freelance culture, almost entirely freelance culture, is done without full recognition of the inbuilt advantages that gives to some people, and it disqualifies other people. I fear, and a lot of the progress is right now at this moment being undone with who does and doesn't get contracts. And that blindness to that, to the ways in which we've structured this industry, builds in advantage and disadvantage, I think is profoundly deep. When I was a young producer in the BBC, one of the truisms, one of the things that everyone said, everyone acknowledged, even though it was never policy, was this. It was always said that if you wanted to advance, you needed to leave, go to the commercial sector, and come back. Everyone believed that. You would hear that from talent managers. Now, what that meant was that people with family wealth and connections who were very like the people in the freelance world, because that's for whom, going 3 months without work meant they went skiing. For people for whom 3 months without work meant they lose their flat, that edict to go and just go and get some commercial experience in the Indies, that wasn't a possibility. And what happened was, in my generation, the people who could do that did do that. They did come back to the BBC. They were promoted. And what you have is you have people who were upper middle class get promoted, get seniority, and people who are from poorer backgrounds, less disadvantaged backgrounds, become the people who work for them. Now, that was a way of hardwiring advantage and disadvantage into a system without ever meaning to. It had exactly the outcomes nobody wanted, which is that it made it harder to advance in this industry without family wealth and family connections. And if you add that to the other hurdle that everyone had to get over, which is what we now call internship, we used to call work experience, which if you were going to set out and design on paper a system to disqualify working class people from working in the media, you'd be hard pressed to come up with something more effective than internship. Those two systems.
It's the only reason I stayed in the industry, which was so tough in some of the stuff that was said to me in my 20s, is because I happened to have parents who happened to have found jobs in London. So we had a house in London, and I stayed at home rent-free till the age of 27. That is the only reason, because I gave weeks and weeks of my life to unpaid work experience. Yeah. And that's it. But so many people don't have that.
Yeah.
The theme of the conference is, of course, power up. How do those words resonate with you? And how would you challenge the who's who of the children's media in this room to power up?
Well, I mean, it makes me think about the sort of optimism I have about young people. And we have, in some ways, the greatest built-in advantage. People who are interested in producing content for children have a generation that I think are, for reasons I do not understand and nobody has explained to me, no one's got a thesis that to me makes sense, that are just profoundly open to ideas, open to challenge, open to the idea that facts don't always make you feel comfortable. I mean, the thing which I find most remarkable is this is a generation facing astonishing disadvantage compared to my generation and the generations above. And yet they are looking at the world with this entrepreneurship, this dynamism, which I find absolutely astonishing. So in some ways, the power up is them. And it's like our job is to kind of
power up your teams with them.
Yeah, and to feed them. I mean, I want to produce content for children because I kind of want to add fuel on the fire, because they're our only hope. Because they're a generation who want change, who believe in social justice to a depth and with a passion that I find astonishing. They're a politicized generation. I was completely alienated when I was a kid because I was so political and no one around me was, and it was seen as like oddity being political. I want to sort of just add fuel to the fire, but they are the fire. They're just astonishing. And it's not all generations have a sense of identity, have a sense of generational mission. Not all generations have a profound difference to their parents. Often it's not that great. I think the last time we had a generational shift like this was in the 60s.
You up for some questions from this audience? They're a nice looking bunch, aren't they? All right, they're all right. Crowd of all sorts, but they're all right. We can also involve our live stream audience, so they can send in questions via Slido. Anyone in the audience that would like to? You know what? Let's go with Izzy. You were a fantastic opening act for David. Izzy Garbutt.
Thank you. I was just wondering, considering the current political climate and especially looking at the way that education has been weaponized in America, to what extent do you think that history should be used to teach ethics and morality, especially when we parallel it between the past and the present in modern society?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure history is the best place to deliver that. The thing which I think we desperately need, and there is no shortage of people who say we must find space on the curriculum for X or Y. I think the thing we desperately need in this country is civics. We don't know how our country works. We don't understand our political system. And if you don't understand the system that is supposed to work for you, then you can't hold it to account. The number of people who will say the phrase, we send them to Westminster to represent our views. No, we don't. It's a representative, not a delegatory system. But people don't know that. I wouldn't, in many ways, say we should be more like America. But the one thing that American kids all come out of school knowing, which is how that political system works. Now, I think they get an exaggerated often they get a sanitized version of the system, but they all understand executive, judiciary, legislative. They all understand how this system of checks and balances, they can all of those kind of cliches of the American system, they are able to recite. We know very, very little. We are taught at school very, very little about how our country and how our political system is supposed to work. And I think if you don't know what it's supposed to do and how it's supposed to empower you, it's much harder to hold people to account because you don't actually really know what their job is and what their function is in the system. So I think history would need to be part of a civics lesson because we need to understand how these systems and institutions evolved, where they came from, what their antecedents are, in longer history. But the thing I think which is most painfully and dangerously missing is civics.
Thank you, Izzy.
Thank you.
See, they know how to ask the right questions. And happy birthday for next month. Faraz Osman has asked, the struggle to turn a profit with British cultural programming is creating a crisis in UK kids' TV. Can the industry, do you think, survive without public intervention?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the risk of the Americanization of everything, of all content. The problem with the sort of, bigger, better model is that bigger, better, certainly the budgets are bigger, and that predilection towards everything being a co-production, I think that is threatening almost every form of television. I think there should be subsidy of children's television. I think it's a public service. And I think the idea of public service broadcasting, the most valued institutions in this country are the NHS and the BBC. They are both expected almost daily to justify their existence. This mismatch between what people actually care about and what people looking in at this country admire and the attitudes of our political leaderships to those institutions is absolutely stark. And I remember when I used to work at BBC and Broadcasting House, you'd come out very often and come out of work and there would be tourists, very often from former British colonies, who'd come to have their photograph taken outside Portland Place because they were brought up on the World Service, because they've been watching BBC World their whole life, because they get what we have and they value it more than we do and certainly more than our politicians do. So this idea that something is a failure if we have to collectively pay for it, if it can't exist purely on a commercial basis, I think that is an interpretation of the value of culture that comes from a political an economic model, which I believe is coming to an end. I think we're back in an age of states, back in an age of people wanting services from their states and coming to an end of a sort of laissez-faire period in global economics. But there's many people who've written more eloquently and know a lot more about that than I do.
That was my grandparents' biggest pride, was hearing me on the World Service in Tanzania, in their kitchen in Tanzania, and hearing me in London. And you cannot underestimate what it means.
Family in Nigeria listening to my name at the end of Radio 4 documentaries that were then played on the World Service when I was in my 20s. And it probably meant more to my Nigerian family than it did to anybody else.
Over here, can we get a mic? Yes, yeah. We'll get a mic too, don't worry. If you introduce yourself as well, that would be great.
Hello, this is Sonoko. I do illustration in England for the last 20 years. So my child, 15 years old, is out of school for the last 2 years. After the lockdown, the depression and anxiety. And then the media has been his life. He is awake in the night and he sleeps during the day. And then that, every moment of his wake life is the media. So the YouTube, Twitch, and then some, streaming services, anime, drama helped him. But, what's your view on the, media for the teens who's already broken in some ways, and how can we help them? What's your view? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the first thing is to say I hope your son's on the road to recovery and feeling better. I think we this idea that reliance on media is a weakness, I think is really appalling. And one of the things that some people will say is that there was always a sense when I was growing up that kind of watching television was seen as sort of bad, and you should be kind of doing something active. And this, you don't hear this very often anymore because of the way media consumption has changed. But you would occasionally, when I was younger, you'd hear people boasting they didn't have a television.
You still do.
Yeah, and it's. I've always found that absolutely just so stupid. You wouldn't.
I genuinely judge, and I have to have my poker face on because I was like,
well, no,
really?
I don't have a bookcase. I just find it such a patronising attitude, and I just think we need to absolutely reject that.
It can be such a friend.
Yeah, and it can be healing, and it can be expansive. And I sat in the council estate as a kid dreaming of going travelling, and it's not sad. It was aspirational, and life-changing, and meant loads to me. And that sort of sense still that there's a kind of snobbery about media, that it is a kind of lower form of culture, that there's something you should be doing instead. I think that kind of lingers on in our society, and I think it needs to be stamped out.
We have a question online saying we've outsourced the useful parts of education to the internet and TikTok. So they say, given how polarized the web is, what do you think about the dangers of that polarization?
Well, I mean, the web is enormously polarized, but it's polarized in terms of. See, people say there's too much information. What there really is too much opinion. I mean, GB News isn't a news channel. These are
good, isn't he? He's good.
These are opinion channels that have emerged. I mean, I think one of the things that I think is quite disturbing, and I think we all do this, is if I say to someone, think about your favorite newspaper, most of us could name the columnists rather than the correspondents and the reporters. The columnists, the people who write opinion, have a far bigger media profile and in some ways a higher status. Now, I write an opinion column. So, saying that it should have a lower status is not exactly my self-interest, but I genuinely think we do, because I sit on the Scott Trust, which is the sort of one of the boards at The Guardian, and I look at, we constantly have presentations to my colleagues who are the actual reporters, and they are astonishing experts. And I think I probably do what everyone else does. I go straight to the opinion pages. I want to see what Marina Hyde's written. We have too much opinion, not too much information.
Fact.
Yeah. And I think it can actually still, despite the enormity of the amount of information, it's sometimes quite difficult to find stuff out, and you've got to really do some digging. To find what someone thinks about something is really easy. To find out what's actually happening, to find out detail, that's a bit harder.
And so often, as you say, behind a paywall. Over here, Mr. Laughing Man in the red jacket. You got a good laugh.
Yeah.
It's hearty, that's good.
Yeah, tell my housemates, thin walls. Hi, my name's Andrew John Simpson. I'm doing a kids' TV puppet show called Lanny's Library. That's why I'm here. My question to you is, we look back at the 60s, we look back at the 70s, and we can kind of sum it up, and the 90s, and look how it was. If you project forward, let's say 50 years, and you look back at these times, how do you think we would sum it up? We know we kind of call it the information age and stuff, and young kids, I don't know what it is now, Gen Z, Gen Alpha versus the millennials. What would your TV program look like if you were looking back at this time now?
Now you have to be Mystic Meg.
Well, I'd like to think that we'd think this was we call this the pre-regulation age, that we'd see this as a crazy period before we grew up and worked out that these media and these platforms need to be regulated like every other form of media that's ever existed. And that we'll be looking back from a place where we've managed to harness the strength but control the obvious, palpable dangers of these platforms and these mediums of algorithms. And of course, this is not to mention AI. We will have found a way of harnessing them for societal good rather than just for commercial profit. So I'd like to think that we're in the final years of the pre-regulated age, and that we look back at it from a more sensible period. Because the fact that we have platforms targeting children in which the people who work on those platforms would not dream of letting their children play with exactly those same platforms, I think that's just appalling. That we have business models based on division, based on engagement that is fueled by anger and division. That we have business models that people know are damaging to the fabric of society, and yet they put their business profits before the societies in which they operate. I hope desperately that we come out of that age and that we understand. And I think part of this movement towards people wanting states to do things again will be expecting states to act in the interest of societies without that sounding kind of po-faced and over-serious. I'd like to think that we're in the final stages of thinking that media this powerful can be allowed to exist unregulated.
I've been told I'm only allowed one more question because people have drinking to do. I don't want to be the one to choose, so David has to choose.
The power of this lady's voice.
You've got great hair, so yeah, I'd have gone with that.
The lady at the front. Can we get a mic?
We've got a mic coming to you this way. The dancing helped as well.
Hi, David. Oh, I'm loud. I want to take you back to school.
Who are you? Who are you?
I am Kadra from South London, and I'm here with my so I want to take you back to school. I have a 14-year-old daughter, and who's got into a really good school through a singing scholarship, actually. So very excited about that. And once she started, she was 14. In year 7, she came back saying, "Oh, Mum, there's this thing that they take us out, all the black kids out into. It's called enrichment." And I was like, "What's enrichment?" It's where they take all the children of colour and they teach them about black history. And I remember in year 7 her coming back and saying, "Did you know the Egyptians were actually African?" She didn't know that. She just saw the media about, so that looking a different colour. And I thought, oh my God, this is amazing. There's a place where these kids can go, and the school are actually putting in the effort to do this. But then, as it's gone on, now I'm starting to think, well, hang on, they're taking these children out of mainstream lessons. They're teaching them all this positive black history, but they're not teaching the children that are not black. So then it's kind of a segregation in itself. So how can we, in children's media, in TV and in education, how can we, and in your work with history and working with education and politics and things like that, how can we avoid it becoming a segregation in itself and in a way a patronising gift? So I just wanted to ask you that, what your views on that.
Thank you. A lot of my work has been trying to argue that these things that we call black history or imperial history are just British history. And I think it's just as valuable for the white kids in South London as the black kid to have that lesson, because for both of them it explains why their world, why their city, why their football team, why their musicians look the way they do and come from the way they do. They come from the places they come from. This is the history we need to understand, how we all came to be together in this society. Without that history, this society makes absolutely no sense. And the idea that we'd want to allow black kids to understand it and for them to make sense of it, but their colleagues at school to not, to me, is a mistake. The great sort of danger of this sort of culture war division is it convinces people, usually older people, very rarely younger people, of something which is completely untrue, which is that my history is a threat to your history. My history is your history. I'm a Geordie Nigerian. That takes some explanation, my parents being able to meet in the Newcastle of the 1960s, that is a very complicated, centuries-long story of engagement between two parts of the world. It's just as relevant for those histories to white kids as it is to black or brown kids. I'm not from the Indian subcontinent. The history of Britain's relationship with India is absolutely fundamental to the history, to the language, to the cuisine, to the culture, and to the demographics of my nation. So the idea that I wouldn't be interested in the history of this country's relationship with the subcontinent is just as crazy. These are our histories. They explain how we became who we are. It's got to be a shared history, and that's, I think, what everybody who cares about this, this thing that's clumsily called decolonization, I think at the heart of it, it's just recognizing that these are not separate silos of history. These aren't kind of tributaries that don't flow into the mainstream. It's all British history.
David, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
If only we could clone you. You're an absolute joy. What an honor it's been to have you here. May I invite Marion back onto the stage, because we have a special Sheffield-made gift for you, David. Is Izzy? Aha, enter Izzy. Come and join us. Come and join us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Izzy, David, Izzy.
Well done. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a bit of a tradition of the conference that speakers get a little memento of their time here in Sheffield. So thank you so much. I mean, that was as solid a start as they come, I'm going to say. So that was, that was absolutely brilliant. And thank you to all of you for being here to see it. Tomorrow, the conference will open with question time at 9:30 in the showrooms cinemas. And I'm sure we can, some of Izzy and David's thoughts will be discussed there with the question time panel, along with other issues that affect kids' media and the business of it. More immediately, and just as important, is the reception at Sheffield Cathedral, sponsored by Ardman, starts now, as soon as you walk on over. For the non-ecclesiastical who may not know the way, apparently there are some foam fingers that some of our wonderful students, volunteers have on. If only the church did that. Do you know, outside a church every Sunday?
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Go like the sport,
there.
exactly. But yeah, have fun, have drinks, and have a lovely conference. I've been Sonali Shah. Thank you so much.